As he walked past the young laundress, the millionaire froze when he saw her pendant, the same one his daughter wore before disappearing 20 years ago. Charles Harrington stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Greenwich mansion, whiskey glass in hand, watching raindrops trace jagged paths down the glass. 20 years of the same ritual, drinking alone while thunder rolled in the distance. The anniversary of the night his world collapsed. "Sir," the voice of his housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, pulled him from his thoughts. "Mr. Sullivan is here." Charles nodded, not turning around. "Send him in." Eric Sullivan entered the study, shaking rain from his umbrella. At 55, Eric had been Charles's attorney for over 25 years, witnessing both the man's rise to business prominence and his personal devastation. "Drinking in the dark again?" Eric asked, flipping on a lamp. "It's tradition," Charles replied, finally turning. The lamplight revealed a handsome face hardened by grief, silver threading through dark hair that had once been entirely black. 20 years today, Eric sighed, helping himself to a drink. "I know, I didn't forget." Neither man spoke as they sipped their whiskey, the silence heavy with memories of a tiny girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. "The police called," Charles finally said. "They officially marked Madison's case inactive last month. Didn't even have the decency to tell me until I called to check." "Bastards," Eric muttered. Charles gazed at the portrait above the fireplace. Catherine holding 5-year-old Madison, both smiling in matching blue dresses. He'd lost them both. Catherine had withered away over 5 years after Madison's disappearance, her grief consuming her until pneumonia finally took what remained. "I'm selling Harrington Textiles," Charles announced abruptly. Eric nearly choked on his drink. "The whole company, Charles. That's your legacy." "What's the point?" Charles shrugged. "No daughter to leave it to. Just another building with my name on it. You could consider charitable options." "I've done enough charity." Charles cut him off, his voice bitter. "Spent millions on private investigators, rewards, search teams. Not one solid lead in 20 years. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room. The thunder that followed was so familiar. Just like that night, the security system had malfunctioned during the storm. The nanny had been found unconscious, and Madison had vanished without a trace. 50 miles away in Willow Creek, Rachel Green wrung out a white shirt, her hands red and raw from hours of laundering in the cold river water. At 25, Rachel had the delicate features and grace that made strangers turn for a second look, though she never noticed. Her honey blonde hair was tied back in a practical ponytail, loose strands framing green eyes that sometimes looked blue in certain light. "You'll catch your death, girl," Mrs. Pemberton called from the riverside. "My tablecloths can wait for warmer weather." "Just finishing up," Rachel called back, smiling. "Besides, Agnes needs her medicine tonight." The mention of her grandmother was enough to silence Mrs. Pemberton's protests. Everyone in Willow Creek knew that Agnes Taylor's heart condition was worsening, and Rachel's laundry service provided the only income for their modest household. Rachel loaded the damp laundry into her weathered bicycle basket. The chain of gold around her neck caught the afternoon sun as she bent forward, a small angel pendant swinging free from beneath her shirt. "That's a mighty pretty thing," Mrs. Pemberton said, eyeing the necklace. "Must be worth something." Rachel's hand instinctively closed around the pendant. "It's not for sale, family heirloom," the older woman shrugged. "Just saying, with Agnes's medical bills." "I'll manage," Rachel said firmly, tucking the pendant back under her shirt. "See you Thursday for the pickup." As Rachel pedaled home, her mind wandered to the pendant, the only connection to parents she couldn't remember. According to Agnes, they had died in a car accident when Rachel was 5, leaving her with only the necklace and a few blurry photographs. Agnes never spoke much about them, and her eyes always grew distant when Rachel asked. The small cottage came into view, whitewashed walls weathered by time, a vegetable garden struggling along one side. It wasn't much, but it was home. "Agnes," Rachel called, entering through the squeaky screen door. "I got Mrs. Wilson's special order done early." Agnes Taylor sat in her rocking chair by the window, her once tall frame now curved with age. At 75, her face was a map of deep wrinkles, but her eyes remained sharp and alert. Too alert sometimes. "You're soaked through," Agnes scolded, motioning Rachel closer. "Working yourself to the bone again." Rachel kissed her grandmother's papery cheek. Dr. Morris stopped by, left your new prescription. Agnes glanced at the small paper bag on the side table and sighed. More pills. More money. Don't worry about that, Rachel said brightly, unpacking the damp laundry. I heard the textile factory in Greenwich is hiring. Mrs. Pemberton's nephew works there. Says the pay is twice what I make now. Agnes's rocking chair stopped abruptly. Greenwich? That's nearly an hour by bus. I could make it work. Maybe rent a room nearby during the week. No. Agnes's voice was sharp, her hands suddenly trembling. You belong here, in Willow Creek, with me. Rachel frowned at her grandmother's unusual outburst. It would only be temporary, until you're better. Agnes seemed to collect herself, her voice softening. I'm sorry, dear, I just worry about you in those big towns. People aren't kind like here. Later that night, after Agnes had fallen asleep, Rachel sat at their small kitchen table counting the week's earnings. Even with every penny saved, they were falling behind on Agnes's medical bills. Something had to change. Her fingers found the angel pendant, tracing its familiar contours, the delicate gold wings, the tiny MH engraved on the back. Agnes had always been strangely protective of it, forbidding Rachel from showing it to anyone. It's all you have left of them, she'd say. Some things are worth more than money. Rachel had never tried to open the pendant, honoring Agnes's wishes to leave it untouched, but sometimes she wondered what secrets it might hold, and why her grandmother's eyes always filled with fear when she wore it outside their home. Charles Harrington's car rolled through the gates of Harrington Textiles the next morning, his driver navigating through the industrial section of the small manufacturing town adjacent to Greenwich. The factory had been his father's pride, the cornerstone of their family fortune, but Charles viewed it dispassionately now. Just assets and liabilities on a spreadsheet. We'll tour the floor, speak with management, then review the closing procedures, he told Eric, who nodded grimly beside him as they walked the production line. Workers nodded respectfully. Charles barely noticed, his mind already calculating severance packages and property values. They headed toward the river path behind the factory, where his father had once proudly shown him the water-powered mechanisms. That's when he saw her, a young woman kneeling by the riverbank, washing clothes, her blonde hair catching the morning light. Something about her profile made Charles pause mid-sentence, but it was the glint of gold at her throat that stopped his heart. An angel pendant. His angel pendant. The one he had custom designed for Madison's 5th birthday, with a secret compartment that held a tiny photo of her as a newborn, an entirely unique piece. Charles stumbled, grabbing Eric's arm for support. Charles! Eric's voice sounded distant. Are you all right? But Charles couldn't answer, his eyes fixed on the impossible, on the pendant that had disappeared 20 years ago. Along with his daughter, on a night just like today's anniversary, the young woman looked up, seeming to sense his stare. For one impossible moment, Catherine's eyes looked back at him. Charles. Charles. Eric's voice finally broke through. You look like you've seen a ghost. Charles couldn't tear his eyes away from the young woman by the river. The pendant, he whispered. Look at her neck. Eric squinted. I don't see the angel pendant, Charles hissed, gripping his friend's arm tighter. The one I had made for Madison, with Catherine's birthstone. The young woman stood, loading her washing into a basket. The pendant disappeared beneath her shirt as she straightened. You're sure? Eric asked cautiously. It's been 20 years, Charles. Memory plays tricks. I designed it myself, Charles said firmly. Had it custom made in Switzerland. There's not another like it in the world. Eric's expression shifted from concern to cautious interest. What do you want to do? Charles watched the woman walk away. Find out who she is, everything about her, but quietly, and the factory closure. A plan was already forming in Charles's mind. Delay it? I have a better idea. Rachel arrived home to find Agnes struggling with her breathing. After helping her grandmother with her medication, Rachel settled into the worn kitchen chair across from her. The textile factory might be closing, she said, relaying what she'd heard from other women at the river. People are saying the owner was there today, looking things over. Agnes's teacup clinked against its saucer. Which factory? Harrington Textiles, in Greenwich. Agnes's face paled. Harrington. Her hand trembled so badly that tea spilled onto the faded tablecloth. "Gran, what's wrong?" Rachel grabbed a dish towel to mop up the spill. "Nothing," Agnes said too quickly. "Just worried about the families who'll lose their jobs." She seemed to collect herself. "Maybe it's a sign you shouldn't look for work there," Rachel sighed. "We need the money, Gran. Doctor, Morris says your heart won't get better without the surgery." "I've lived my life," Agnes replied stubbornly. "I won't have you sacrificing for me." Their argument was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Pemberton stood on the porch, excitement radiating from her plump face. "Have you heard?" she asked without preamble. "Harrington's not closing the factory. He's renovating his mansion and needs help. Housekeepers, kitchen staff, groundskeepers, paying double the factory wages." Rachel's heart leapt. "Are you sure?" "My nephew just called. They're taking applications tomorrow morning. He says they need at least 20 people." Mrs. Pemberton grabbed Rachel's hands. "You should go, with your cleaning skills. They'd hire you in a heartbeat." After Mrs. Pemberton left, Rachel turned to Agnes, hopeful. "It's perfect. I could work days at the mansion and still be home nights." The look on Agnes's face stopped her cold. "No," Agnes said, her voice unnaturally firm. "Not the Harrington house. Anywhere but there." "Why?" Rachel asked, bewildered. "You don't even know them." Agnes stood shakily. "I'm tired. We'll discuss it tomorrow." That night, Rachel lay awake, confused by her grandmother's reaction. Agnes had never shown interest in local wealthy families before. Why would the name Harrington affect her so strongly? In the darkness, Rachel made her decision. Tomorrow, she would apply at the mansion and keep it a secret until she had secured the job. Agnes would understand once the money started coming in. "This is insane," Eric said, reviewing the staffing plans in Charles's study. "Hiring 20 people you don't need just to get close to one girl." Charles looked up from Madison's case file, which he'd been poring over all night. "I need to know if it's her, Eric." "And if it is," Eric challenged. "What then? She's a grown woman now, with a life of her own." Charles closed the file. "Then I'll have my daughter back." Eric softened. "Charles, even if by some miracle this girl is Madison, she won't be the 5-year-old you lost. She won't remember you." "I know that," Charles snapped, then took a steadying breath. "But she's still my daughter, my blood." "Just proceed carefully," Eric advised. "No DNA tests or private investigators before we know more. If someone took her, they could be dangerous if cornered." Charles nodded reluctantly. "I'll observe her first, see if there are other signs." The next morning, Charles watched from his office window as applicants lined up outside the staff entrance. His heart raced when he spotted her, the blonde woman from the river, dressed simply but neatly. Clutching a well-worn handbag, he instructed his housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, to hire her regardless of qualifications. 2 hours later, Mrs. Reynolds reported back. "Rachel Green," she said, reading from an application. 25 years old, lives with her grandmother in Willow Creek, no formal education beyond high school, but references say she's a hard worker. "Rachel," Charles repeated, tasting the unfamiliar name of the woman who might be his daughter. "She starts tomorrow. I've assigned her to the 3rd-floor rooms, including the East Wing." Charles nodded approvingly. The East Wing contained Madison's untouched bedroom and Catherine's music room, places that might trigger memories if any remained. The mansion exceeded all of Rachel's expectations. 3 stories of pristine white stone, its windows gleaming in the morning sun as her bus approached the long driveway. She'd lied to Agnes, saying she had found work at a local hotel. The deception sat uneasily in her stomach, but the promised salary had been too good to refuse. A stern-faced woman named Mrs. Reynolds gave her a quick tour, rattling off rules and expectations. Rachel nodded attentively, trying not to gawk at the crystal chandeliers and marble floors. "The 3rd floor is your responsibility," Mrs. Reynolds explained. "Mr. Harrington rarely uses those rooms, but they must be maintained to standard, dusting, vacuuming, changing linens weekly." As they climbed the grand staircase, Rachel felt a strange sensation, almost like déjà vu. The polished banister beneath her fingertips seemed oddly familiar. Though she knew she'd never been in a house this grand before, the feeling intensified when they reached the 3rd floor. A long hallway stretched before them, with doors on either side. Rachel's head began to throb. "Are you unwell, Miss Green?" Mrs. Reynolds asked, noticing her hesitation. Just a bit overwhelmed, Rachel admitted. It's a beautiful home. Mrs. Reynolds' expression softened slightly. You'll get used to it now. This door here leads to the music room, Rachel said automatically, then froze, wondering where the words had come from. Mrs. Reynolds looked surprised. Yes, that's right. How did you know? Rachel shook her head. Confused. Lucky guess, it just seems like a corner room would be for music. Good acoustics. The housekeeper studied her for a moment, then continued the tour. Rachel followed, fighting the disconcerting sense that she had walked these halls before, at the end of her first day, exhausted but exhilarated by the generous pay advance in her purse. Rachel nearly collided with a tall man in an expensive suit as she left through the staff door. I'm so sorry, she gasped, stepping back. Charles Harrington looked down at her, his intense gaze making her uncomfortable. No harm done, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. You must be new. Yes. Sir Rachel Green. I'm working upstairs. Something flickered in his eyes. Welcome to Harrington House, Rachel. I hope you'll be comfortable here. As she boarded the bus home, Rachel couldn't shake the odd feeling that Mr. Harrington had been studying her, not with the dismissive glance of an employer, but with something much more personal, as if he were looking for something in her face, or someone. Charles stood in the doorway of Madison's bedroom, watching Rachel dust the collection of untouched toys. For 2 weeks, he had found reasons to be near her, observing her every movement for clues, and every day brought new evidence that made his heart race with possibility. Now, as Rachel tilted her head while working, humming softly to herself, Charles felt his breath catch. Catherine used to tilt her head exactly that way when concentrating. A small, unconscious gesture their daughter had inherited. The room is coming along nicely, he said, making Rachel jump. Mr. Harrington, I didn't hear you. She straightened, embarrassed. I've been careful with everything, just as Mrs. Reynolds instructed. Charles stepped into the room, a space he rarely entered anymore. The pink canopy bed, the shelves of stuffed animals, the dollhouse he'd had custom built in England, all preserved exactly as they had been 20 years ago. This was my daughter's room, he said quietly. Rachel's expression softened. I didn't know you had a daughter. Had, Charles emphasized. She disappeared many years ago. I'm so sorry, Rachel said. Her green eyes filled with genuine sympathy. How old was she? 5, Charles answered, picking up a small teddy bear from the shelf. This was her favorite. She called him Mr. Buttons. Rachel smiled sadly, then frowned, her hand reaching up to her temple. Are you all right? Charles asked, noticing her discomfort. Just a headache. I've been getting them since I started working here. She attempted a smile. Probably just the dust. Charles nodded, though he noted the information carefully. Perhaps some fresh air would help. The gardens are lovely this time of year. Thank you, sir. But I should finish my work. Of course. He placed the bear back exactly where it had been. By the way, Mrs. Reynolds tells me you've been making good progress in the music room. It's my favorite room in the house, Rachel admitted, though I'm not sure why. Something about it feels peaceful. Charles fought to keep his expression neutral. My wife was a pianist. She taught our daughter to play. That's lovely, Rachel said. I've always wanted to learn, but never had the opportunity. Charles hesitated. The piano is still in tune. You're welcome to try it if you'd like. He left before she could respond, his heart pounding. The seed had been planted. That evening, Rachel found herself drawn to the music room after her shift ended. The grand piano stood by the window, bathed in the golden light of sunset. She glanced around guiltily, then sat on the bench. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She'd never had a lesson in her life, yet something pulled at her, an urge she couldn't explain. Hesitantly, she pressed a key, then another. The notes seemed to awaken something inside her. Without thinking, her fingers began to move across the keys in a simple melody. Rachel gasped, pulling her hands back as if burned. How did she know how to do that? Impressive for someone who's never played. Rachel whirled around to find Charles standing in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. Mr. Harrington, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. What was that piece? He interrupted. I don't know. Rachel admitted, confused. My hands just seem to remember something my mind doesn't. Charles approached slowly. It was for Elise, my wife's favorite. She played it for our daughter every night before bed. Rachel stood, suddenly uncomfortable. I should go. My grandmother will be worried. Of course. Charles stepped aside. Though if you'd like piano lessons, I could arrange them. You seem to have a natural talent. That's very generous, but think about it, he said. Good night, Rachel. On the bus ride home, Rachel couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. How had her fingers known what to do? It was like her body remembered something her mind had forgotten. She arrived home to find Agnes sitting in the dark, her medication untouched beside her. Gran, why are you sitting in the dark? Rachel switched on the lamp. Have you taken your evening pills? Agnes's face was drawn with worry. Where have you been working, Rachel? Rachel froze. I told you, the Meadowbrook Hotel. Don't lie to me. Agnes's voice was unusually sharp. Mrs. Pemberton saw you getting off the bus from Greenwich. She said you're working at the Harrington Mansion. Rachel sighed, sitting across from her grandmother. I didn't want to worry you. The pay is excellent, Gran. Enough for your surgery. You have to quit, Agnes said, her hands trembling. Tomorrow, find work somewhere else. Why, what is it about the Harringtons that frightens you so much? Rachel demanded. Do you know them somehow? Agnes looked away. I just don't trust wealthy people. They use people like us. Mr. Harrington has been nothing but kind, Rachel insisted. In fact, he offered to arrange piano lessons for me. Agnes's teacup clattered against its saucer. Piano lessons, why? He heard me playing. Well, trying to play. Rachel shrugged. It's strange, actually. I sat down at the piano and my fingers just knew what to do. The color drained from Agnes's face. That's enough. I forbid you from going back there. Forbid me? Rachel stood, anger rising. I'm 25 years old, Gran, and we need the money. Some things are more important than money, Agnes whispered, her eyes filled with a fear Rachel couldn't understand. Charles paced his study, unable to sleep. The image of Rachel at the piano kept replaying in his mind, her hands moving instinctively over the keys, playing Catherine's favorite piece. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Come in. Eric entered, holding a manila folder. You wanted to see me. She played for Elise tonight, Charles said without preamble. No lessons, no training. Her fingers remembered. Eric sighed, setting the folder on the desk. Charles. She tilts her head like Catherine when she concentrates. She found her way to the music room without directions. She's allergic to strawberries. I had Mrs. Reynolds test it by serving strawberry tarts at staff lunch. Rachel broke out in hives just like Madison used to. These could all be coincidences, Eric cautioned. And this, Charles pulled a tissue from his pocket, carefully unfolding it to reveal a single blonde hair. I managed to get this today. We can run a DNA test. Eric stared at the hair. If you do this, there's no going back. If she is Madison, you're opening a criminal investigation. Whoever took her could be dangerous. I need to know, Eric. Charles's voice broke. I've waited 20 years. Eric nodded reluctantly. I'll have my contact at the lab run it discreetly, but Charles, even if she is Madison, she's been raised as someone else. She has a life, attachments. Like this grandmother she keeps mentioning. Charles's jaw tightened. The woman who might have stolen my daughter. We don't know that, Eric warned. Proceed carefully. Watch Rachel, but don't alarm her or anyone around her until we know more. After Eric left, Charles opened the folder his friend had brought, the preliminary background check on Rachel Green. Her birth certificate looked legitimate at first glance, listing parents who had supposedly died in a car accident when she was 5. But the hospital listed didn't match records for births that day, and the doctor's signature was from a physician who had retired 2 years before the certificate's date. Charles's hands tightened on the paper. 20 years of dead ends. And now, finally, a thread to pull. Eric Sullivan drove through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, the quaint storefronts and modest homes a stark contrast to Greenwich's opulence. He parked his BMW across from the town's only diner, attracting curious glances from locals unaccustomed to luxury vehicles. Inside, he slid into a booth and ordered coffee, casually scanning the breakfast crowd. After 20 minutes of eavesdropping on local gossip, He'd learned more about Willow Creek's residents than any background check could provide. Refill. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with a name tag reading Dottie, held the coffee pot expectantly. "Please." Eric smiled warmly. "I'm actually hoping you might help me. I'm looking into some family history. An old friend's mother used to live here. Agnes Taylor, I believe she still does." Dottie's eyebrows rose. "Agnes, sure. Everyone knows Agnes and her granddaughter live in that little white cottage past the Miller's Road." She leaned closer. "Poor thing's not doing well. Heart problems. The granddaughter, Rachel, works herself to the bone trying to pay for treatments. Rachel's not actually her granddaughter, though." "Right," Eric asked casually. "I thought Agnes never had children." Dottie frowned. "Of course she's her granddaughter. Rachel's lived with Agnes since she was a little thing. Parents died in a car wreck. When was that exactly? Must be 20 years ago now. Rachel couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. Dottie straightened. "Why all the questions about Agnes?" "Just reconnecting with old family friends," Eric said smoothly, leaving a generous tip as he stood. "Thanks for your help." Outside, he called Charles. "The timeline matches," he reported. "Agnes Taylor started raising Rachel around the same time Madison disappeared. I'm heading to the county clerk's office next to check property records." By afternoon, Eric had uncovered something unexpected. Agnes Taylor had moved to Willow Creek 20 years ago. But before that, she'd worked as a housekeeper for the Prestons, Charles's neighbors in Greenwich, until she abruptly quit without notice. "The Prestons," Charles repeated when Eric called again. "Michael and Eleanor." "The same," Eric confirmed. "Agnes worked for them for 15 years, left suddenly in the middle of the night. According to employment records, the date, 3 days after Madison disappeared." Charles gripped the phone tighter. "Who else worked for the Prestons back then?" "I'm still looking into that. But Charles, this connects Agnes directly to your neighborhood at the time of the kidnapping. Find out everything about the Preston staff," Charles instructed. "And Eric, be careful. If Agnes Taylor is involved, she might recognize you as my attorney." Rachel found Mr. Harrington surprisingly absent during her next few days at work. Mrs. Reynolds informed her that he was away on business, which gave Rachel time to catch her breath and reflect on the strange tension between her and Agnes. Her grandmother remained adamant that Rachel quit, but refused to give a concrete reason beyond vague warnings about those people. Rachel had never seen Agnes so agitated, and it worried her. On Thursday, while dusting the library shelves, Rachel discovered a photo album tucked between leather-bound classics. Curious, she opened it to find family photographs. Charles and a beautiful dark-haired woman holding a blonde toddler. The woman must be Mrs. Harrington, Rachel realized. The resemblance between mother and daughter was striking. As she turned the pages, watching the little girl grow through birthdays and Christmases, Rachel felt an inexplicable sadness. This must be the daughter Mr. Harrington had mentioned, the one who disappeared. She closed the album respectfully and returned it to its shelf. Later, cleaning the master bedroom, Rachel noticed a jewelry box on the dresser. Though she'd been explicitly instructed not to touch personal items, something drew her to it. Inside, nestled on velvet, lay a pendant identical to her own, a golden angel with tiny diamonds for eyes. Rachel gasped. Backing away, it couldn't be a coincidence. Her hand went to her own pendant, hidden beneath her uniform. How could Mr. Harrington's wife have the same unique piece? Her head began to throb violently, images flashing behind her eyes. A woman's gentle hands fastening the necklace around her neck, the scent of lilac perfume, a bedtime story about guardian angels. Rachel steadied herself against the wall, breathing deeply until the pain subsided. What was happening to her? Why did this house trigger these strange episodes? She completed her shift in a daze and hurried home, determined to get answers from Agnes miles away in Savannah. Georgia, a man who called himself Martin Brooks, read his mail with trembling hands. The envelope contained no return address, just a newspaper clipping about Harrington Textiles and its owner's plans to renovate his mansion. Martin crumpled the paper, his weathered face contorting with rage. In 20 years, he'd built a life far from Connecticut, a modest carpentry business, a small house, a quiet existence where no one knew his real name or past. Now this, a warning clearly, from someone who knew his secret, Someone letting him know that Charles Harrington was stirring up old history. Martin reached for the phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. It rang 4 times before a frail voice answered. "Hello? It's me," he said gruffly. "I got a clipping in the mail today about Harrington." Silence. Then a whispered, "I can't talk about this." "Is it true?" Martin pressed. "Is he renovating the mansion? Hiring new staff?" "Yes," the voice admitted reluctantly. "But it has nothing to do with us. It's been 20 years. Martin laughed bitterly. "You think he's forgotten? You think I have?" "Please," the voice begged. "We agreed never to contact each other again." "Things change," Martin said coldly. "I'm coming north." "No, you can't. She works there now, at the mansion." Martin's grip tightened on the phone. "What did you say?" "She needed the money for my medical bills. I tried to stop her, but—" "You fool," Martin hissed. "If he sees her, if he recognizes her—" "He already has," the voice whispered. "I think he suspects something. She's been having headaches, remembering things." Martin slammed the phone down, his mind racing. 20 years of careful planning, of silent payments, of building a new identity, all jeopardized because that old woman couldn't keep the girl away from Harrington. He had to act quickly. Before Charles Harrington discovered the truth, before the girl remembered, before everything he'd done, everything he'd sacrificed was exposed. Agnes hung up the phone, her hands shaking violently. Marvin's call had confirmed her worst fears. He was coming back, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. She hobbled to her bedroom closet, pulling out an old hat box hidden beneath yellowed linens. Inside lay her last resort, an envelope of cash saved over the years, emergency papers, and a small revolver Marvin had left with her, just in case. Agnes stared at the gun with revulsion. She'd helped commit one terrible crime 20 years ago. But she'd drawn the line at violence. Never again would she be party to anyone getting hurt, especially not Rachel. A noise at the front door made her hastily close the box. Rachel entered, her face troubled. "Gran, we need to talk," she said, her voice unnaturally steady. "I found something at work today." Agnes felt her chest tighten. "What is it, dear?" Rachel pulled her pendant from beneath her shirt. Mrs. Harrington had one exactly like this, identical, down to the smallest detail. Agnes sank into her chair, the room spinning around her. That's not possible," she whispered unconvincingly. "Don't lie to me anymore," Rachel said, tears forming in her eyes. "What aren't you telling me? Why do I have the same pendant as Mr. Harrington's missing daughter? Why do I know how to play the piano when I've never had lessons? Why does that house feel so familiar?" Agnes closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 20 years of deception crushing down on her. "Rachel, please, not tonight. I'm not feeling well. No more excuses." Rachel's voice broke. "I deserve the truth." Before Agnes could respond, a sharp pain shot through her chest, radiating down her left arm. She gasped, clutching at her heart as the room darkened around her. The last thing she heard was Rachel's panicked voice calling her name, and the sound of the telephone being frantically dialed. The antiseptic smell of Willow Creek General Hospital burned Rachel's nostrils as she paced the waiting room. 3 hours had passed since the ambulance had rushed Agnes in, her small, frail body barely visible among the emergency equipment. "Miss Green?" A tired-looking doctor approached. Clipboard in hand, Rachel rushed forward. "How is she?" "Stable for now." He removed his glasses. "Your grandmother suffered a serious cardiac event. We've managed to stabilize her condition, but she needs surgery, soon. The procedure you mentioned before, the one we've been saving for." The doctor nodded grimly. "Her heart is failing, without intervention. I can't guarantee how long she has." Rachel swallowed hard. "When can you do it?" "There's the matter of payment," he began delicately. "I'll have it," Rachel said firmly. "I just started a new job, better pay. We'll need a substantial deposit by next week to schedule the procedure." After making arrangements to visit Agnes in the morning, Rachel trudged home in the darkness. The cottage felt empty without her grandmother's presence. No kettle whistling, no creaking rocking chair, no soft humming of old hymns. Rachel changed into her nightgown mechanically, her mind racing. She needed to keep her job at the Harrington mansion more than ever now. Whatever secrets Agnes was keeping would have to wait. As she turned down her bed, something caught her eye. Agnes's hat box, partially visible under the bed. Rachel hesitated, then pulled it out. If there were financial papers inside, she might need them for the hospital. The box contained a small stack of cash, nowhere near enough for the surgery, some faded identification papers, and at the bottom, something that made Rachel's blood run cold. A revolver, small but deadly looking. Why would her gentle, law-abiding grandmother have a gun hidden in her bedroom? Beneath the weapon lay a yellowed newspaper clipping. Rachel unfolded it carefully, reading the bold headline. Harrington heiress, still missing. Reward increased. The article, dated 20 years ago, detailed the kidnapping of 5-year-old Madison Harrington during a storm. The accompanying photograph showed a solemn Charles Harrington and his wife Catherine, holding a picture of their missing daughter, a small blonde girl with striking green eyes. Rachel's hands began to shake. The resemblance was unmistakable. The child in the photo could have been Rachel herself at that age. Her fingers reached instinctively for her pendant. M.H. Madison Harrington. No, she whispered. It can't be. But the pieces were falling into place. Her inexplicable familiarity with the mansion, the matching pendant, the piano playing, even her strawberry allergy that had always puzzled Agnes since no one else in their supposed family had it. Could she, Rachel Green, actually be Madison Harrington? And if so, what role had Agnes played in her disappearance? Charles answered his cell phone on the first ring, heart racing at the late-night call from Eric. DNA results are in, Eric said without preamble. 99.8% match. She's Madison. Charles sank into his chair, overcome after 20 years of false leads and disappointments. The confirmation hit him with physical force. Charles, are you there? Yes, he managed. She's really my daughter. There's more, Eric continued. I've been digging into Agnes Taylor's past. She didn't just work for the Prestons. She was having an affair with your former driver, Marvin Brooks. Charles frowned. Marvin, the one who disappeared right after Madison was taken. Exactly. Police investigated him briefly, but found nothing. What they didn't know was his connection to Agnes. They were seeing each other for at least 2 years before Madison's kidnapping. So Agnes and Marvin took Madison together, Charles concluded, anger rising in his chest. It looks that way, and here's the concerning part. I tracked Marvin to Savannah, Georgia. He's been living under the name Martin Brooks, but his neighbors say he left town suddenly 3 days ago, packed a bag and just disappeared. Charles felt a chill. You think he's coming here? I think we need to move carefully. If Marvin's involved, he could be dangerous. And if Agnes realizes we're onto her, Rachel, Madison, could be in danger. Charles finished. We need to get her away from Agnes, bring her here where she's safe, without alarming her or tipping our hand, Eric cautioned. We still don't know the full story. I'll think of something, Charles promised. In the meantime, have security increased around the property, and Eric, thank you. After hanging up, Charles stared at the framed photo of Catherine and Madison on his desk. Finally, after all these years, he had found his daughter. The challenge now was bringing her home without putting her at risk. Rachel arrived at the mansion the next morning, exhausted and distracted. She had barely slept, her mind churning with questions she couldn't answer. Mrs. Reynolds noticed immediately. You look terrible, dear. Is everything all right? My grandmother's in the hospital, Rachel explained. Heart problems. I'm so sorry. The housekeeper's stern face softened. Perhaps you should take the day off. Rachel shook her head firmly. I need the money for her treatment. I'll be fine. As she climbed the stairs to begin her duties, Rachel wondered how she could approach Mr. Harrington. What would she say? Excuse me, sir, but am I your long-lost daughter? The very idea was absurd. She needed proof, something more substantial than coincidences and her own confused feelings. Determined, Rachel made her way to Mr. Harrington's study during her lunch break. She knew he was in meetings downtown all morning. Mrs. Reynolds had mentioned it. This might be her only chance to search for answers. The study was immaculate, with leather-bound books lining the walls and a massive mahogany desk dominating the room. Rachel hesitated at the threshold, knowing she was crossing a line, but the need to understand her past outweighed her concerns. She moved quickly to the desk, scanning the organized surface. Most papers appeared to be business-related. Contracts, financial reports, correspondence with companies. Nothing personal. Then she spotted a silver-framed photograph partially hidden behind a stack of folders. Rachel picked it up, her breath catching in her throat. The photo showed a beautiful dark-haired woman, Catherine Harrington, wearing an evening gown. Around her neck hung an angel pendant identical to Rachel's. Rachel sank into the desk chair, staring at the image. There could be no doubt now. Her pendant had belonged to Catherine Harrington, mother of the missing Madison. A noise in the hallway startled her. Rachel hastily replaced the photograph and stood, but not before noticing a manila folder labeled Madison in the desk's center drawer, which had been partially open. Heart pounding, she slipped from the study just as Mrs. Reynolds rounded the corner. "Ah, there you are, Rachel," Mr. Harrington called. "He'd like you to prepare the guest room in the east wing. He's bringing a specialist in to examine some of the antiques, and they'll be staying overnight." Rachel nodded, relieved that her snooping had gone undetected. Of course, right away. As she gathered fresh linens for the guest room, Rachel made her decision. Tonight, after her shift, she would confront Agnes with what she had found. No more secrets, no more evasions. She deserved to know the truth about who she really was. What she didn't know was that Charles had orchestrated the guest room preparation as an excuse to have Madison's DNA sample quietly collected from her hairbrush and toothbrush, evidence he might need in the coming legal battle, and neither of them realized that Marvin Brooks had just checked into a motel on the outskirts of Willow Creek. Watching the bus stop where Rachel would descend that evening, his hand resting on the gun in his jacket pocket, the hospital room was eerily quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors. Agnes lay small and fragile against the white sheets, tubes and wires connecting her to machines tracking her weakened heart. Rachel sat beside her, clutching her grandmother's thin hand. "You should be at work," Agnes whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mrs. Reynolds gave me the afternoon off when she heard about your condition." Rachel hesitated, then reached into her bag. "Gran, I need to ask you something." She carefully unfolded the newspaper clipping she'd found in the hat box. Agnes's eyes widened at the sight of it, her monitor suddenly beeping faster. "Where did you find that?" she asked hoarsely. "In your bedroom, along with this." Rachel placed the angel pendant on the blanket between them. "It's not just similar to Mrs. Harrington's necklace. It's identical. This belonged to her. Didn't it?" Agnes closed her eyes, tears seeping from beneath her lids. "Rachel, please. My name isn't Rachel, is it?" Her voice broke. "It's Madison. Madison Harrington." The old woman's face crumpled in grief. Before she could respond, the door opened and a nurse entered, frowning at the elevated heart rate displayed on the monitor. "Everything all right in here?" she asked, checking Agnes's vitals. "Fine," Rachel said quickly, slipping the pendant back around her neck. "We were just talking." The nurse looked skeptical but nodded. "Try not to upset her. Her heart can't handle much stress right now." After she left, Agnes reached weakly for Rachel's hand. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. "You have to believe that. Then tell me the truth. All of it." Agnes took a shuddering breath. "Not here. Too many people. Might overhear." "When then?" "You've been avoiding this conversation for years." "Tomorrow," Agnes promised. "When I'm stronger, I'll tell you everything. About the night, about Marvin, about why we had to run." Rachel frowned. "Marvin, who's Marvin?" Agnes's eyes widened with fear. "I've said too much, please. Just go home and rest. Come back tomorrow." Though frustrated, Rachel could see her grandmother was reaching her limits. She kissed Agnes's forehead and promised to return in the morning. Outside the hospital, Rachel pulled out her phone, ready to call a taxi, when a voice behind her made her jump. "Miss Green." She turned to find Eric Sullivan, Charles Harrington's attorney, standing by a black sedan. "Mr. Sullivan, what are you doing here?" "Mr. Harrington sent me when he heard about your grandmother's condition." Eric's smile was professional but warm. "He'd like to offer you a ride back to your cottage." Rachel hesitated. It seemed an unusual gesture from an employer, but the alternative was an expensive taxi ride she could ill afford. "Thank you. That's very kind." During the drive, Eric kept the conversation light, asking about Agnes's condition and expressing appropriate concern. Only when they were halfway to Willow Creek did he broach a different subject. Mr. Harrington mentioned you discovered the music room in the East Wing, he said casually. Beautiful piano, isn't it? Rachel tensed slightly. Yes, it is. He said you played quite well for someone untrained. Eric glanced at her. Natural talent is extraordinary. Mr. Sullivan, why are you really here? Rachel asked directly. I doubt Mr. Harrington sends his attorney to chauffeur every employee with a sick relative. Eric smiled slightly. You're very perceptive. The truth is, Mr. Harrington is concerned about you. He feels a connection. He lost his daughter about 20 years ago, around the same time you lost your parents. Rachel's heart raced. Was this an opening to ask about Madison? But something held her back. She needed to hear Agnes's side of the story first. That's a sad coincidence, she said carefully. Yes, coincidence. Eric looked as though he wanted to say more, but instead changed the subject. We're almost at your cottage. Is there anything you need? Groceries? Medications? No, thank you. You've been very kind, when the car stopped outside her home. Rachel was alarmed to see the front door slightly ajar. She was certain she'd locked it before leaving for the hospital. Wait here, Eric said sharply, noticing her expression. Let me check. No, it's fine, Rachel insisted, though her stomach knotted with fear. Probably just the wind. The latch sometimes doesn't catch. Eric looked unconvinced. I'll wait until you're safely inside. Rachel approached her door cautiously. The cottage appeared empty, but something felt wrong. Items on the countertop were slightly rearranged, and Agnes's hat box was now on the kitchen table, open. She turned to wave at Eric, forcing a smile until his car pulled away. Then she carefully searched the small house, finding no one. But the gun that had been in Agnes's hat box was missing. Charles paced his study, phone pressed to his ear. What do you mean something was wrong? The cottage had been searched, Eric replied. Rachel was trying to hide it, but I could tell she was spooked. And I spotted a man watching the house from a car down the street. Older, weathered face. Could have been Marvin Brooks from the description I found. Charles cursed under his breath. We need to move now. Bring her here tonight. On what pretense? We can't just kidnap her, Charles. It's not kidnapping if she's my daughter. She's in danger. We need to be strategic, Eric insisted. I've stationed 2 security professionals near her cottage. They'll keep watch tonight, tomorrow. You can speak with her directly. Tell her what we know. Charles reluctantly agreed, though every instinct screamed at him to protect his newly found daughter. After hanging up, he stared at Madison's baby picture on his desk. I won't lose you again, he whispered. At Willow Creek General Hospital, Agnes Taylor drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain medication making her thoughts foggy. A shadow falling across her bed roused her. Rachel, she called weakly, eyes struggling to focus in the dimly lit room. Not quite, a gravelly voice answered. Agnes's eyes widened in terror as the figure stepped closer. A man in his 60s with hard eyes and a face lined by years of bitterness. Marvin, she whispered, how did you get in here? Hospitals are easy. Everyone's too busy to notice one more visitor. He settled into the chair Rachel had vacated. We need to talk, Agnes. There's nothing to say. It's over. Marvin leaned forward. It's not over until I say it's over. I saw her today. Our little Madison, all grown up, looks just like her mother. Agnes's heart monitor beeped faster. Leave her alone. She knows nothing. But she's starting to remember, isn't she? His smile didn't reach his eyes. And now she's working for Harrington. Did you know he's been watching her? Has his people following her? How do you know that? I've been watching too. Marvin's voice hardened. 20 years, Agnes. 20 years I've been sending you money, keeping quiet, living in that backwater town, and now it's all coming apart because you couldn't keep her away from that house. She needed the job, Agnes pleaded, for my medical bills. Always so self-sacrificing. He sneered. Well, it ends now. I'm taking her with me tonight. No. Agnes tried to sit up, setting off alarms on her monitor. You can't. I can, and I will. She's the only leverage we have against Harrington. This was never about her, Agnes said desperately. It was about hurting Charles. About the money. But Rachel, Madison, she's innocent. No one's innocent. Marvin stood as a nurse rushed in, attracted by the beeping alarms. Not even you, Agnes. He slipped out as medical staff surrounded Agnes's bed. Her fragile heart racing dangerously from fear and desperation, Rachel couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old cottage made her jump. Convinced someone was trying to break in, around midnight, she finally dozed off, only to be awakened by her phone ringing shrilly. "Miss Green," a woman's voice, professional but urgent. "This is Nurse Winters from Willow Creek General. Your grandmother has taken a turn for the worse. The doctor thinks you should come right away." Rachel dressed hurriedly, trying to calm her racing thoughts. As she left the cottage, she noticed a car with 2 men parked down the street, the same car that had been there when Eric dropped her off. Were they watching her house? The taxi arrived quickly. As they drove to the hospital, Rachel stared out the window at the rain that had begun to fall, reminding her of the storms that had plagued her dreams for years. Dreams of running through dark hallways, a man's angry voice, a woman crying. At the hospital, Rachel found Agnes conscious, but barely so. The doctors had been forced to sedate her after her episode earlier, but she had been insisting on speaking with Rachel. "Gran, I'm here," Rachel said, taking her hand. "What happened?" Agnes's eyes flickered open, fear evident in their depths. "He came," she whispered. "Marvin, he's here." "Who is Marvin?" Rachel asked urgently. "What does he want?" Agnes struggled to focus. "He helped take you that night during the storm." Rachel leaned closer. "You're saying he kidnapped me? You both did." Agnes nodded weakly. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way. Never meant for anyone to get hurt. But someone did get hurt. The nanny," Agnes whispered, tears sliding down her wrinkled cheeks. "She tried to protect you. Marvin pushed her. She fell, hit her head." Rachel felt sick. "She died?" "Yes." Agnes's grip tightened on Rachel's hand. "I couldn't leave you with him after that. He was so angry, so violent. I took you away, raised you as my own, loved you like my own." "Why?" Rachel's voice broke. "Why did you take me in the first place?" "Revenge," Agnes said simply. Marvin wanted revenge against Charles Harrington, for humiliating him, firing him, and I loved Marvin, helped him. The confession hung in the air between them. 20 years of lies finally exposed. "You need to go to Charles," Agnes continued urgently. "Tell him everything. He'll protect you from Marvin." "I can't just leave you here," Rachel protested. "You must." Agnes's voice was fading. "Marvin will come for you tonight. He has the gun." Her eyes closed as the sedation pulled her back under. "I'm sorry, Madison, so sorry." Rachel sat frozen beside her grandmother's bed, the woman who had stolen her from her real family yet loved her unconditionally for 20 years. Outside, the storm intensified, lightning flashing across the sky. Just like the night her life had been forever altered, rain lashed against the windshield as Rachel clutched the steering wheel of Agnes's old Ford, her mind reeling from the confession. She was Madison Harrington, the missing heiress, the lost daughter, the child whose face had been on national news 2 decades ago. And Agnes, the woman she'd called grandmother, her entire conscious life, had helped steal her. The highway to Greenwich stretched before her, dark and slick with rain. Rachel had no plan beyond Agnes's urgent instruction. Go to Charles, tell him everything. But what would she say to the man who was apparently her father? How could she face him knowing she'd been living in plain sight all this time? As she drove, fragments of memories surfaced like debris after a storm. A woman's gentle voice singing lullabies. A man's deep laugh as he swung her high in the air. The scent of lilacs and piano music. Her mother, her father, her real family. The mansion came into view, its windows glowing like beacons in the storm. Rachel parked at the service entrance, soaked within seconds as she ran to the door and rang the bell. "Mrs." Reynolds answered, her usual stern expression melting into concern at the sight of Rachel dripping on the doorstep. "Miss Green, what on earth?" "I need to see Mr. Harrington," Rachel interrupted, her voice shaking. "It's urgent." "It's nearly midnight, Mr. Harrington isn't—" "Please," Rachel begged. "It's about Madison." Mrs. Reynolds's eyes widened. Without another word, she ushered Rachel inside and disappeared up the grand staircase. Minutes later, Charles Harrington appeared in the foyer, still dressed despite the late hour, his face a mask of controlled emotion. "Rachel," he said quietly. "Or should I say Madison?" The simple acknowledgement broke something in Rachel. tears she'd been holding back spilled down her cheeks. "You knew. I suspected from the moment I saw your pendant. I confirmed it with DNA testing." He took a hesitant step toward her. "I was going to tell you tomorrow," Eric advised, waiting until we had more information about Agnes and Marvin Brooks. Rachel finished. "Agnes told me everything tonight. She's in the hospital. Her heart," she faltered, unsure how to reconcile her love for Agnes with the terrible truth of what she'd done. Charles guided her gently to the study, where a fire blazed in the massive stone hearth. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and poured 2 glasses of brandy, handing one to Rachel. "Agnes confessed to helping Marvin kidnap me," Rachel said after taking a fortifying sip. "She said he wanted revenge against you." Charles nodded grimly. "Marvin was my driver. I caught him embezzling funds and threatened to expose him. I should have gone to the police immediately, but I gave him a chance to resign quietly first. 3 days later, you were taken. Agnes said there was an accident. The nanny, Helena," Charles supplied, his voice tight. "She died trying to protect you." A distant memory surfaced. A young woman screaming, a loud thud. Stillness, Rachel shuddered. "I'm starting to remember bits and pieces. The piano playing, the layout of the house, even your wife. My mother." She looked up at him. "What was she like?" Charles's expression softened. "Catherine was extraordinary, brilliant, kind, passionate about music. You have her eyes, her way of tilting your head when you're thinking." He smiled sadly. "She never gave up hope of finding you. It destroyed her in the end. Agnes said she died 5 years after I disappeared. Officially. Pneumonia. But she'd stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Her body simply gave up." Charles looked into the fire. "I poured myself into work after that. It was the only way to keep going." They sat in silence for a long moment, the enormity of their shared loss hanging between them. "What happens now?" Rachel finally asked. "That depends on you." Charles leaned forward. "Legally, you're my daughter and heir. The Harrington name and legacy are yours by right, but I understand this is overwhelming. Overwhelming doesn't begin to cover it," Rachel said with a humorless laugh. "Yesterday I was Rachel Green, laundress from Willow Creek. Today I'm Madison Harrington, heiress to a fortune." She shook her head. "I don't know who I am anymore." "You're both," Charles said simply. "The young woman Agnes raised, and the daughter Catherine and I loved. One doesn't negate the other." Rachel twisted the angel pendant between her fingers. "Agnes is still in danger. Marvin came to the hospital today. He threatened to take me away, said I was leverage against you." Charles's expression darkened. "He won't get near you again. I'll have security at the hospital immediately. I should be there when she wakes up," Rachel said, surprising herself with the protective instinct she still felt toward Agnes, despite everything. "I understand your attachment to her," Charles said carefully, "but you need to remember, she participated in your kidnapping, in Helena's death. She also protected me from Marvin, raised me, loved me." Rachel's conflicting emotions churned inside her. "I can't just turn that off overnight." Charles nodded reluctantly. "We'll figure it out together. For now you should rest. Your old room is still there, just as you left it." He hesitated. "Unless you'd prefer a guest room." The thought of sleeping in a child's bedroom preserved as a shrine to a missing 5-year-old, to her former self, was too strange. A guest room. "Please." As Mrs. Reynolds led her upstairs, Rachel felt like she was walking through a dream. The mansion that had seemed so unfamiliar just weeks ago now resonated with half-remembered details. The slight creak in the 3rd stair, the way the upstairs hallway curved, the pattern of the molding along the ceiling. In the elegant guest suite, Rachel sat on the edge of the 4-poster bed, overwhelmed. Her entire identity had been built on a foundation of lies. Yet Agnes's love had been real. The childhood memories, the comfort of their small cottage, the values Agnes had instilled in her, those weren't lies. How could she reconcile the woman who had helped kidnap her with the grandmother who had sacrificed everything for her well-being? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Charles stood there, awkward and formal in a way that broke Rachel's heart a little. "I thought you might want this," he said, holding out a framed photograph. "It was taken on your 4th birthday." The picture showed a laughing child, herself, held between Charles and Catherine Harrington, all three beaming at the camera. "Thank you," Rachel whispered, taking the frame. Charles nodded stiffly, clearly wanting to say more but restraining himself. "Good night, Madison." The name hung in the air between them, her true name, yet one that felt foreign on her ears. "Rachel," she said gently. "I think I need to be Rachel a little longer, until I figure this out." Of course, the disappointment in his eyes was palpable, but he smiled anyway. "Good night, Rachel." Alone again, Rachel, or Madison, she wasn't sure anymore, stared at the photograph until her eyes blurred with tears. 2 lives, 2 identities, 2 families. One built on privilege and love that had been brutally stolen, the other constructed from deception yet tempered with genuine devotion. As the storm raged outside, Rachel curled up on the luxurious bed, clutching the picture of the family she couldn't remember, wondering if she would ever truly feel whole again. Agnes opened her eyes to find a police officer stationed outside her hospital room door. Inside, a nurse checked her vitals while Eric Sullivan stood by the window, speaking quietly into his phone. "Full confession recorded. Yes, she's stable enough for questioning," he was saying. The attorney noticed she was awake and ended his call. "Mrs. Taylor, how are you feeling?" "Where's Rachel?" Agnes asked, ignoring his question. "Safe with her father." Eric approached the bed. "Mr. Harrington has arranged for round-the-clock security here and at his home." Agnes closed her eyes briefly in relief. "Marvin, no sign of him yet, but we'll find him." Eric pulled a chair closer. "Mrs. Taylor, I've been authorized to discuss your situation, given your cooperation and medical condition. Mr. Harrington is willing to forego pressing charges." "I don't care about charges," Agnes interrupted weakly. "I deserve whatever punishment comes. Just keep her safe from Marvin." Eric studied her thoughtfully. "Tell me about him. Why is he so fixated on revenge after all these years?" Agnes sighed, her frail body seeming to sink deeper into the mattress. Marvin had been with the Harringtons for years. He started embezzling when his gambling debts got out of control. When Charles discovered it, Marvin was humiliated, not just fired, but made to apologize to the entire household staff. That hardly justifies kidnapping a child. For a man like Marvin, pride is everything. Agnes's voice grew distant. He didn't want money. He wanted Charles to suffer like he had suffered. Taking Madison was about making Charles feel powerless. "And you helped him." There was no accusation in Eric's tone, just a statement of fact. "I loved him," Agnes said simply. "Or thought I did. I was the housekeeper next door, invisible to everyone except Marvin. He made me feel special, needed." What went wrong that night? Agnes's eyes clouded with the memory. The storm knocked out the security system. Marvin knew the house. He'd driven for the family for years. We were supposed to take Madison while she slept. Leave a ransom note. Keep her for a few days, then find her abandoned but unharmed, just long enough to terrify Charles. She paused, her monitor beeping faster. But the nanny heard us. She came into the room and recognized Marvin. There was a struggle. He pushed her, and she fell against the marble fireplace. Eric nodded grimly. Helena Winters, 23 years old. After that, everything changed. Marvin became someone else. Cold, calculating. He said we had to take Madison and disappear, that it was murder now. Agnes's voice broke. I couldn't let him hurt that little girl. She was so scared, crying for her mother. So I suggested we split up. I took Madison to calm her down while he cleaned up evidence. But you never met back up with him, Eric guessed. I ran, Agnes admitted. Took the child and what cash I had and just drove until we reached Willow Creek. Changed our names, created a new life, I told Madison, Rachel, that her parents had died in an accident. Eventually, she stopped asking about them. Did Marvin find you? 3 years later. By then, Rachel thought of me as her grandmother. She had no memory of her life before. Agnes's eyes filled with tears. Marvin threatened to kill us both if I didn't pay him to keep quiet. I sold the jewelry I'd taken from the house that night. Sent him money whenever he demanded it. Eric made notes as she spoke. Did he ever mention Catherine Harrington, Charles's wife? Agnes frowned, only to gloat when she died. Why? Before Eric could respond, his phone rang. He stepped out to take the call, leaving Agnes alone with her thoughts and regrets. Rachel woke disoriented in the guest room, momentarily forgetting the previous night's revelations. The luxury around her seemed surreal after a lifetime in the cottage's modest surroundings. A knock at the door revealed Mrs. Reynolds with a breakfast tray. "Mr. Harrington thought you might prefer to eat in private this morning," she explained, setting down the tray. "He's in his study when you're ready to speak with him." "Thank you," Rachel said, noticing how differently the housekeeper treated her now. No longer a servant, but the long-lost daughter of the house, after eating and dressing in the clothes Mrs. Reynolds had thoughtfully provided. Rachel made her way downstairs. The mansion felt different now that she knew it was her childhood home. Each corner seemed to whisper memories just beyond her grasp. She found Charles in his study, surrounded by documents. He stood immediately when she entered, his eagerness to connect with her evident in every gesture. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "As well as could be expected," Rachel replied. "Any news about Agnes or Marvin?" "Agnes is stable. I've arranged for the best cardiac specialist to consult on her case." Charles hesitated. "As for Marvin, the police are searching, but there's no sign of him yet." Rachel nodded, grateful for his consideration toward Agnes despite everything. "I'd like to visit her today." "Of course, with security," Charles added firmly. "Eric recorded Agnes's confession last night. It's enough to press charges against Marvin for Helena's death and your kidnapping. And Agnes," Charles's expression softened at the concern in her voice. "Given her cooperation and condition, we've agreed not to pursue charges against her." Relief flooded through Rachel. Whatever Agnes had done, the thought of her facing prison in her frail state was unbearable. "Thank you," she said simply. Charles gestured to a chair. "There's something else we need to discuss." Eric discovered something concerning during his investigation. He handed her a folder. "These are Catherine's medical records from the years after your disappearance." Rachel opened the file, scanning the documents inside. "What am I looking for?" "The toxicology reports," Charles said grimly. "Catherine became ill about 2 years after you were taken. Doctors diagnosed depression and autoimmune issues, but Eric had her old samples retested. They found traces of thallium, a slow-acting poison with symptoms that mimic natural illness." Rachel looked up in shock. "You think Marvin poisoned her? He had access to our home for years as the driver. Even after he disappeared, he could have paid someone on staff." Charles's voice tightened with suppressed rage. "Catherine didn't die of grief or pneumonia. She was murdered as part of Marvin's revenge." The revelation hit Rachel like a physical blow. Not only had this man stolen her from her family, but he had also methodically killed her mother. The last lingering doubt about where her loyalties should lie vanished in a surge of fury. "We need to find him," she said, her voice hard. "The police are—" "No," Rachel interrupted. "I know how to find him. Agnes always kept a list of drop points where she left money for him over the years. It's in her hat box at the cottage." Charles was already reaching for the phone. "I'll have Eric get it immediately." As he made arrangements, Rachel wandered to the window, watching rain drip from the eaves. The storm had passed, but she felt another building on the horizon. "There's something else I want to do," she said when Charles finished his call. "Anything. I want to see my room, my real room." She turned to face him. "I think I'm ready to be Madison now." Marvin Brooks watched the hospital from his parked car, rage simmering at the sight of the police officer outside Agnes's room. His carefully constructed vengeance was unraveling by the hour. His phone rang, the burner he'd purchased when arriving in town. The caller ID showed a blocked number. "Mr. Brooks," a smooth voice said when he answered. "Or do you prefer Martin these days?" Marvin tensed. "Who is this?" "Someone who shares your interest in the Harrington family. I understand you're in a difficult position. Perhaps we can help each other." "I'm listening," Marvin said cautiously. "I have information about Madison Harrington's whereabouts and security arrangements. I also have access to Agnes Taylor's room at Willow Creek General." "What do you want in exchange?" The voice chuckled. "Let's just say Charles Harrington has enemies beyond yourself. Meet me at the abandoned Preston estate at midnight, and we can discuss terms." After hanging up, Marvin considered his options. It could be a trap, but he was running out of alternatives. Without Agnes's cooperation or access to Madison, his leverage was evaporating. He started his car, unaware that the call had been traced by Eric's security team, and that even now, police were converging on his location. The door to Madison's childhood bedroom swung open on silent hinges. Rachel, now consciously trying to think of herself as Madison, stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the preserved shrine to her 5-year-old self. Pink walls, a canopy bed with satin ribbons, shelves lined with dolls and stuffed animals, their glass eyes reflecting 2 decades of patient waiting, a dollhouse replica of Harrington Mansion, perfect down to the miniature furniture. "We can redecorate," Charles said quickly, mistaking her silence for distaste. "This was just how you left it." Madison stepped inside, running her fingers over the pristine surfaces. "You kept everything exactly the same." "I couldn't bear to change it," Charles admitted. "It felt like giving up hope." Madison lifted a porcelain doll from the shelf, its blonde curls and green eyes eerily similar to her own childhood photographs as she held it. A fragment of memory surfaced, her mother brushing the doll's hair while singing softly, teaching her to be gentle with treasured things. "Annabelle," she whispered, the name coming from nowhere. Charles stared at her. "Yes, that's what you called her. Your favorite." Madison set the doll down carefully, her heart pounding. "I'm remembering things, little pieces." She moved to the bookshelf, her fingers tracing the spines of children's books. They lingered on one with a worn cover, The Velveteen Rabbit. "You insisted on this story every night for months," Charles said, watching her closely. "You would say the lines along with me. When a child loves you for a long time, not just to play with but really loves you, then you become real," Madison quoted automatically, then looked up in surprise. "I remembered that." Charles's eyes glistened. "It's still in there, all of it." Madison continued her exploration, each object triggering scattered fragments. A music box that played Claire de Lune, a snow globe from their trip to Aspen, the teddy bear missing one eye because she'd accidentally pulled it off. At the window seat, she paused, a stronger memory washing over her. Sitting here during a thunderstorm, her mother's arms around her, telling her not to be afraid, that angels watched over her. The pendant at her throat suddenly felt heavier. "Mom gave me this," Madison said, touching the angel, "to protect me from the storms." Charles nodded, unable to speak. Madison turned to face him fully. "I want to remember everything. I need to. Dr. Levine, a specialist in recovered memories, can help," Charles said. "She'll be here tomorrow, but Madison," he hesitated, "some memories might be painful." "I know," she said firmly, "but they're mine, and they might help us find Marvin before he hurts anyone else." Charles's phone rang, interrupting the moment he answered, his expression growing serious as he listened. "They found Marvin's car at the motel, but he was gone," he reported after hanging up. "Police believe someone tipped him off." Madison frowned. "How could anyone know the police were coming?" "I don't know," Charles admitted. "But Eric found Agnes's hat box. The list of drop points was there, along with some old photographs and jewelry. The jewelry she stole from here that night," Madison realized. "She kept some pieces back from Marvin." Charles nodded grimly. "Including your mother's sapphire earrings. Catherine was wearing them the night you were taken." A heavy silence fell between them, the weight of all that had been stolen. Time, memories, lives, pressing down on them both. "I want to visit Agnes," Madison said finally. "She might know where Marvin would hide." Agnes looked diminished against the hospital pillows, tubes, and wires connecting her frail body to machines. Her eyes brightened when Madison entered, though uncertainty quickly replaced the initial joy. "Rachel, or should I call you Madison now?" she asked weakly. "I'm still figuring that out myself," Madison admitted, taking the chair beside the bed. Charles remained standing near the door, his presence both protective and intimidating. Agnes's gaze moved between them. "You look so much like your mother," she said softly. "I should have known Charles would recognize you immediately." "You should have told me the truth years ago," Madison said, unable to keep the hurt from her voice. "Would you have forgiven me then any more than you can now?" Agnes asked. Madison had no answer. Instead, she reached for Agnes's hand. "The police are looking for Marvin. They found his car, but he's disappeared. Do you have any idea where he might go?" Agnes tensed visibly. "He has a place, a cabin where he took you initially before I ran with you." "Where?" "By Lakeview Point, abandoned hunting cabin. It's where..." Agnes trailed off, looking away. Where what? Charles asked sharply. Where he made me bring the money all these years, Agnes finished, though Madison sensed she was holding something back. Did he have accomplices? Charles pressed. Someone who might be helping him now. Agnes shook her head. Marvin doesn't trust anyone, except... Her brow furrowed. There was someone, a gardener who worked for the Prestons. They kept in touch after everything happened. A name, Charles demanded. Wilson, Watson, something with a W. Agnes's frustration was evident. I'm sorry, my memory isn't what it was. Madison squeezed her hand. It's okay, we'll find him. As they prepared to leave, Agnes caught Madison's sleeve. Be careful, she whispered urgently. Marvin is more dangerous than you know. She broke off, glancing nervously at Charles. What is it? Madison asked. He bragged about it once when he was drunk, Agnes said, her voice dropping lower. About Catherine, how clever he was, making her death look natural. Charles stiffened by the door. He put something in her tea, Agnes continued. For months, said no one would ever connect him to it, that Charles would live with the guilt of thinking she died of a broken heart. Madison looked to her father, whose face had gone ashen. We already know, she told Agnes gently. Eric found evidence in the medical records. Agnes closed her eyes, tears slipping down her wrinkled cheeks. I'm so sorry for everything. In the hallway outside, Charles leaned against the wall, visibly shaken, despite having already known about Catherine's poisoning. The confirmation from Agnes had made it painfully real. I should have protected her, he said hoarsely. I was so focused on finding you, I missed what was happening right in front of me. Madison touched his arm hesitantly. You couldn't have known. Charles straightened, grief hardening into resolve. Lakeview Point. I know exactly where that cabin is. The Prestons used to take us hunting there. Should we tell the police? Of course, Charles said. Already dialing, but I'm not waiting for them. Night had fallen by the time they reached Lakeview Point, the narrow road winding through dense forest. Charles had insisted on coming despite Eric's strenuous objections, and Madison had been equally adamant about accompanying him. Stay in the car with the security team, Charles instructed as they parked a quarter-mile from the cabin. I'll just scout the perimeter. We go together or not at all, Madison said firmly. I've spent 20 years living a lie because of this man. I deserve to face him. After a tense standoff, Charles relented, though he insisted one security officer accompany them, while the other maintained position with the vehicle and coordinated with police, who were still 30 minutes out. The cabin stood dark and apparently deserted in a small clearing, its wooden boards weathered by decades of exposure. As they crept closer, Madison felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. She had been here before, in the arms of a terrified Agnes as they fled into the night. I remember this place, she whispered. The creak in the third porch step, the broken shutter. Charles exchanged glances with the security officer, who drew his weapon and moved toward the door. A sudden crack of breaking branches from behind made them all turn. A flashlight beam blinded them momentarily. I was wondering when you'd figure it out, Marvin Brooks's gravelly voice called from the darkness. Took you long enough, Charles. As Madison's eyes adjusted, she made out Marvin's silhouette, a tall, lean man with a weathered face and cold eyes. In one hand he held a flashlight. In the other, a gun pointed directly at Charles. 20 years I've waited for this moment, Marvin continued, stepping closer. To see your face when you finally understood how completely I destroyed your life. It's over, Marvin, Charles said evenly. The police are on their way. Agnes has confessed everything. Marvin laughed harshly. You think I care about that? I've accomplished what I set out to do. I took your daughter. I took your wife. I took 20 years of your life. His gaze shifted to Madison. Hello, little Madison. All grown up now? You look just like your mother. Madison's blood ran cold at the casual mention of her mother's murder. You're a monster, she said, her voice steady despite her fear. No, Marvin corrected, his gun unwavering. I'm justice. Your father humiliated me, threatened me, so I showed him what real power looks like. His smile was terrible in the flashlight's glow. And now it's time to finish what I started. The security officer moved suddenly, raising his weapon, but Marvin was faster. A shot rang out, echoing through the trees as the officer fell. Madison screamed as Charles lunged forward, tackling Marvin. The two men crashed to the ground, struggling for control of the gun. "Run!" Charles shouted to Madison. "Get back to the car!" But Madison couldn't move, frozen in horror as her father and her kidnapper fought in the dirt. 20 years of hatred unleashed in a desperate struggle. When the gun went off again, her paralysis broke. She ran forward, not away, driven by an instinct deeper than fear. 1 year later, the morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Cathedral, casting colorful patterns across the assembled mourners. Madison Harrington stood at the podium, her blonde hair gleaming in the rainbow light, her green eyes clear and steady as she addressed the gathering. "Agnes Taylor wasn't perfect," she began, her voice carrying through the hushed space. "She made terrible mistakes. She participated in a crime that altered many lives forever, including my own. But she also loved me, protected me, and in the end, helped bring a dangerous man to justice." The crowd, a mix of Willow Creek residents who had known Rachel Green in Greenwich society who now recognized Madison Harrington, listened in respectful silence. In her final days, Agnes found the courage to face her past and make amends. She couldn't undo what had been done, but she could help me find my way back to my true family. Madison's gaze found Charles in the front row. For that, I will always be grateful. Agnes had survived her heart surgery, defying medical expectations to live 8 more months, long enough to testify against Marvin Brooks and to watch Madison forge a new life that honored both her past and her present. As the service concluded, Madison joined her father outside, in the year since the confrontation at the cabin. Their relationship had grown cautiously but steadily. The initial awkwardness had given way to genuine connection, as Madison recovered more of her childhood memories with the help of therapy. "Beautiful service," Charles said, squeezing her hand. Agnes would have appreciated it. Madison nodded, her feelings toward her kidnapper, turned grandmother still complicated. She wanted to be buried here in Willow Creek, among the people who knew her as just Agnes, not as part of a notorious crime. They walked to the waiting car, where Eric Sullivan stood chatting with Dr. Levine, the memory specialist who had helped Madison navigate her recovered memories. "Ready for this afternoon?" Eric asked as they approached. Madison took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." Today marked not just Agnes's funeral, but also the official launch of the Taylor Foundation, Madison's initiative to help vulnerable women and search for missing children. She had insisted on naming it after Agnes, a decision that had initially confused the Greenwich social circle, but which made perfect sense to Madison. It acknowledged both her past and her determination to create something positive from tragedy. "The media will be there," Charles cautioned as they drove toward the Harrington mansion. "You don't have to speak if you're not comfortable." "I want to," Madison assured him. "This foundation is important." As they rounded the familiar curve of the driveway, Madison couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in a year. The night at the cabin had nearly ended in tragedy. The second gunshot had grazed Charles's shoulder, but he had maintained his grip on Marvin's wrist. Madison had grabbed a fallen branch, striking Marvin with enough force to stun him and allow Charles to secure the weapon. When police arrived minutes later, they found Madison applying pressure to her father's wound, while the second security officer handcuffed a semi-conscious Marvin Brooks. During his trial, Marvin had shown no remorse. His testimony revealed the full extent of his methodical revenge, not just Madison's kidnapping and Catherine's poisoning, but years of psychological torture, sending Charles anonymous notes and manipulating Agnes through fear and blackmail. The court had sentenced him to life without parole for the murder of Helena Winters, the kidnapping of Madison, and the murder of Catherine Harrington. Agnes had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. Though in the public's eye, she remained forever linked to the crime. Many had questioned Madison's continued relationship with her, but Madison understood something most did not, that people could be both terrible and kind, both villains and saviors. "We're here, Miss Harrington," the driver announced. Pulling Madison from her memories, the mansion grounds had been transformed for the foundation launch. A large tent stood on the lawn, filled with board members, donors, and partner organizations. Banners bearing the Taylor Foundation logo, an angel with outstretched wings, fluttered in the spring breeze. As Madison moved through the crowd, graciously accepting congratulations and introductions, She caught glimpses of her two worlds merging. Mrs. Pemberton from Willow Creek, chatting animatedly with Mrs. Reynolds, Dr. Morris, who had treated Agnes for years, deep in conversation with Charles's business associates. Eric found her near the refreshment table. "Everything's ready for your speech, and there's someone who wanted to meet you first." He led her to a quiet corner, where a young woman waited, clutching a photograph. "This is Jennifer Winters," Eric explained gently, "Helena's younger sister." Madison felt her heart skip. Helena Winters, the nanny who had died trying to protect her 20 years ago. "Ms. Winters," Madison said, extending her hand. "I'm so grateful you came." Jennifer's eyes shimmered with tears. "I had to see for myself, the little girl my sister loved enough to die for." "I wish I remembered her better," Madison admitted. "The therapist says those memories might never fully return. I brought something that might help." Jennifer handed her the photograph, a young woman with auburn hair holding a laughing toddler. "That's Helena with you, on your 3rd birthday." Madison stared at the image, a vague memory stirring, gentle hands braiding her hair, a voice singing silly songs to make her giggle. "The Foundation's first scholarship is named for her," Madison said, "for young women pursuing careers in child care or education." Jennifer smiled through her tears. She would have loved that. When it was time for the formal presentation, Madison took her place at the podium. Facing cameras and distinguished guests, Charles stood proudly nearby, his presence a steady anchor in her still evolving life. "Welcome to the launch of the Taylor Foundation," Madison began. "Some of you might wonder why I chose this name, given the circumstances of my story. The answer is simple. Our identities are shaped not just by blood, but by every person who touches our lives." She touched the angel pendant at her throat, newly restored, with the tiny compartment now holding 3 miniature photographs, herself as a baby with Catherine and Charles, Agnes in her rocking chair, and Helena Winters smiling in the Harrington garden. "This foundation will support women in crisis, those facing difficult choices, impossible circumstances, and seemingly unforgivable mistakes. It will also dedicate resources to searching for missing children and supporting families torn apart by tragedy." As Madison detailed the foundation's initiatives, she felt a sense of purpose more profound than anything she had known as either Rachel Green or Madison Harrington. This work represented both of her lives, the compassion she had learned in Willow Creek and the resources she had inherited as a Harrington after the presentations and interviews. Madison slipped away to the garden. The setting sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, and she welcomed the moment of solitude. "It went beautifully," Charles said, joining her by the rose trellis. "Your mother would have been so proud." Madison smiled. "I wish I remembered her better." "You will." "In time," Charles assured her. "And even the memories that don't come back, they're still part of you, still shaping who you are." As they watched the sunset together, Madison felt the weight of the angel pendant against her skin. It had once been a secret burden, a mystery she couldn't solve. Now it was a symbol of her unique journey, a reminder that identity wasn't fixed or singular, but woven from all the threads of one's life. Later that evening, as guests departed and twilight settled over the mansion, a lone figure observed from the distant tree line. The man watched father and daughter return to the house, his weathered face impassive in the fading light. He had followed the story of Madison Harrington's return with detached interest, another thread in the complex tapestry of Charles Harrington's life. Now, seeing the foundation launch splashed across media outlets, he had decided it was time to make his own long-delayed appearance. After all, Marvin Brooks wasn't the only one who had scores to settle with the Harrington family. The man turned away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. His time would come, but not tonight. Tonight, he would let them celebrate their happy ending, unaware that in some stories, the final chapter remained unwritten.